This is Nina with Saying Stories. I've been working as a scriptwriter and video editor for the channel. Some of you might also know me from my Instagram page at Slowdive, where I talk about monthly releases, underrated records, and fully indulge in my obsession with shoegaze. Today, I want to delve into my personal favorites of the genre. With so many amazing albums out there, it was quite challenging to narrow it down to a top 10 list. Hence, I decided to feature only one album per band. All the albums mentioned both hold significant emotional meaning for me and have managed to stand the test of time. Lastly, I want to emphasize that everything shared in this video reflects solely my personal opinion. But now, without further ado, let's dive in. Number 10. Doused, Murmur. Doused are a fairly recent band that emerged from the Philly shoegaze scene in the late 2010s, with Murmur being their only full-length album to date. It opens with the iconic sample from 2001, A Space Odyssey, where Hell 9000, in the midst of being switched off by Commander Dave, expresses a glimpse of human emotion in anticipation of his consciousness leaving him. I feel like this perfectly sets the tone for what's about to come. It's one of the dreamiest and haziest records I've ever heard. It somehow manages to teleport you into an almost hypnagogic state of mind, where you find yourself drifting away into this vague dimension, right at the verge of being awake and dreaming. In good old shoegaze fashion, it isn't short on dense and fuzzy sound walls, as shown in songs like Ease or Again. However, what really adds to the otherworldly nature of the record are the mostly instrumental ambient tracks that allow the album to flow incredibly smoothly. Thrill is a 2.5 minute long, reverberating, rinse-ripped guitar loop that evokes the sensation of levitating, while AZ5 is a synth-heavy, IDM reminiscent track that to me sounds quite like the missing link between Slowdive and Boys of Canada. I spent countless hours zoning out to this album the summer it was released, and it has stuck with me ever since. Number 9. A Place to Bury Strangers, Exploding Head. A Place to Bury Strangers are arguably one of the loudest bands out there. Their blend of shoegaze and noise rock is designated to audibly rupture your ear membranes, and to me, nothing quite beats blasting this album at maximum volume. Small medical excursion here. The exploding head syndrome refers to a sleep disorder, causing you to experience the auditory hallucination of hearing a loud noise or explosive crashing sound in your head, which I think works fairly well as a description of the sensation they seemingly aim to create with their music. In comparison to their debut album, though, the songwriting seems to have evolved on Exploding Head, adding a bit more light and shade to it. It has its more melodic moments. In fact, songs like Keep Slipping Away or the title track, Exploding Head, sound a bit like you infused new wave with some extra fuzz and overdrive. The biggest standout for me, however, might be Ego Death, a song so steeped in feedback with dark industrial drums and vocals. It feels like a deconstruction of that fine line that separates music from pure noise. This pairs well with Oliver Ackermann's antics on stage, of relentlessly demolishing his Fender at every gig, and gluing it back together afterward. And while hearing them play live will most likely leave you with ringing ears for days, I think it's quite worth the experience. Number 8. Ringo Deathstarr, self-titled. While Ringo Deathstarr are undoubtedly one of the best shoegaze revivalists out there, their most recent output might actually be my favorite so far. I've seen critics argue that some of their works might be a bit too derivative of My Bloody Valentine or the Jesus and Mary chain, but to be honest, I kinda love how they are keeping the rather old school, slightly punkish shoegaze spirit alive, while adding their own twists to it. Gazin' is essentially an ode to the genre, with various famous shoegaze band names and song titles hidden in the lyrics. It feels like a love letter to their roots, all wrapped up in an incredibly catchy song. mind sticking to just one lane though. For instance, God Help the Ones You Love explores a more phased out, yet pretty vocal-centered sound, while Disease features a pedal steel run through numerous effects, giving it a hypnotic and very neo-psychedelia reminiscent touch. I remember reading somewhere that shoegaze sounds like you're holding a puppy in the middle of an atomic explosion, and I literally can't think of any track that captures that essence better than the closing track of the album, Cotton Candy Clouds, where the sweet tones of Alex Gehring's angelic vocals create such a delightful counterpoint to the rushes and heavily distorted guitars. Number 7. Default, California Nebula. Although California Nebula may not frequently make it to discussion about the heavyweights of the genre, I feel like it has quietly become a hidden fan favorite within the scene. Default are a Chinese group that might have one of the most interesting and flourishing shoegaze scenes nowadays, that we might get into in a future video. As the album cover, depicting a distant view of the emission nebula NGC 1499, also called California Nebula, might suggest, this record truly feels like it's inviting you on a journey through the endless vastness and beauty of the universe. If I were to become a space traveler, this undoubtedly would be among the records I take with me. While the first two tracks open with rather gentle tones and melting vocals, it smoothly diverges between quieter moments and bursts of pure static noise. It ultimately explodes into one of the most transcendent noisy outros I've ever heard, on the final track, Schwarzschild Rainhole, which very much feels like passing through the event horizon of a black hole and being sucked right into it. Number 6. The Jesus and Mary Chain, Psychocandy. There is an ongoing discussion whether Psychocandy actually qualifies as shoegaze, or it should be viewed more as a predecessor to the genre. But despite being released in 1985, I guess I'd die on the hill that it might even be the first shoegaze album ever created. It features most of, if not all, of the key ingredients. And as we already mentioned in our Origins of Shoegaze video, the Rolling Stone magazine's review describing it as bubblegum pop drowned in feedback that fused melody with obnoxious bursts of white noise. To be fair, sounds like quite an accurate characterization of many shoegaze records. This apparent dichotomy is what I probably enjoy the most about it. The 60s girl group type of beat on Just Like Honey that transcends into a frenetic flood of noise on the next song, The Living End. It's almost like the Ronettes were trying to launch a punk band. The album's approach seems rather simple, with pretty straightforward 3-chord progressions and jangly melodies, all cracked up to a maximum level of distortion. I really love the raw and seemingly effortless nature of it. It's as if they stumbled upon something extraordinary without even trying, and that's what ultimately makes this record stand out. Number 5. Bethany Curve, You Brought Us Here. Bethany Curve is a band that is, in my opinion, criminally overlooked, which might partly be because they peaked in the late 90s and early 2000s, a time when most of the world was completely sleeping on shoegaze. While they have always pretty consistently remained their style, You Brought Us Here marks my personal favorite. It's where they completely mastered their niche of creating dark and heavily textured shoegaze. There's an incredibly gloomy and surreal mood to it, achieved through rather monotonous drums, intertwined with layers of meandering and droning guitars. What I particularly enjoy is how they allow the atmospheric tension to build up slowly, especially on the over 10-minute long track An Illusion. It almost feels more like listening to one really long song instead of separate tracks on an album. Richard Miller's vocal style has a slightly gothic note to it. I think you can hear echoes of The Cure, but also a bit of Slowdive and Cocteau Twins. Overall, this album is just sublime, and I'd recommend it to anyone who might have missed out on it. Number 4. Nothing, the Great Dismal. Nothing aligns with many so-called Shoegaze bands, which predominantly lean towards the heavier, more alt-rock and grunge-orientated end of the spectrum. While Nothing's theme was always a bit doom and gloom, The Great Dismal appears to be their most introspective work so far. Existence hurts existence, according to Dominic Palermo, were the first words he jotted down when thinking about lyrics for the album. A line that would later feature in the song Famine Asylum. It's a contemplative reflection on the battle with his inner demons, the exhaustion of relentless touring, and the ghosts from his turbulent past haunting him. Despite all the misery declared in his lyrics though, the album doesn't feel cold or isolating, but more like a warm blanket you would want to hide under. It bridges the gap between gritty grunge riffs on songs like Say Less or Bernie Sanders, and the floaty reverbs of Blue Mecca or In Blueberry Memories. And while I'm absolutely digging their entire catalogue, The Great Dismal might be the most cohesive work so far, and one of the best post-shoegaze efforts of this day and age. Before we get to the top 3, I'd like to include some honorable mentions that didn't quite make the cut, but are just way too good to be completely left out. Number 3. My Bloody Valentine, Loveless. I have to admit, my expectations when listening to Loveless for the first time were sky high. Revolutional, the album that pioneered the genre, perhaps the very definition of shoegaze itself. I've heard it all, and I guess as it is often the case with iconic albums, they are iconic for a reason. Nonetheless, Loveless needed some time to grow on me. It may have taken me to learn more about his backstory. Kevin Shields basically reinventing guitar play with his distinct glide guitar technique, creating the illusion of an extremely multi-layered sound, the endless studio hopping, and, allegedly, almost driving the record label Creation Records into bankruptcy, to ultimately connect with it. But since then, it has steadily climbed the ranks, to eventually become one of my favorite albums of all time. Loveless feels like a fever dream of vibrant swirling colors, translated into sound. The distorted sound walls become so dense at points that it doesn't come off as a surprise that both Kevin Shields and Belinda Butcher reportedly suffered from tinnitus during its recording. Kevin's technique of layering various versions of sped up or slowed down vocal tracks, along with Belinda often recording her singing in her semi-awake state in the middle of the night, blurs the vocals into an almost indistinguishable part of the instrumentation at certain points. Ultimately, I think it's a combination of all of these elements that renders this album one of the most sensual and otherworldly experiences we'll ever encounter. Number 2. Have a Nice Life, Deathconsciousness. Have you ever listened to an album for the first time and immediately known it was going to change your life? That pretty much sums up the feeling I had when I first heard Deathconsciousness. I was a bit unsure about whether to include it because it isn't a typical shoegaze album, but more like a fusion of various genres, ranging from post-punk to shoegaze, drone and gothic rock. It was coined under the term post-industrial doomgaze by the band themselves, and I feel like they pretty much created their own genre here. In fact, I've never come across any band that comes close to their sound, but I eventually just needed it on this list. What might in part be responsible for its unique nature is the fact that its recording was done with very low budget equipment. Dan Barrett recorded the vocals through his laptop mic, and the original master recordings were lost during a hard drive crash. However, The lo-fi and raw production almost serve to enhance the nihilistic theme of the album. Deathconsciousness conveys the harsh reality of being trapped in an inescapable cycle of misery and depression, while aware that you're eventually going to die either way. It's quite the album you would want to listen to at the end of the world. While Bloodtail reflects upon the futile struggles of grappling with all the perversive suffering in life, leaving the word arrowheads echoing in your head long after, the washed-out drones of I Don't Love eventually guide you to finding peace in it all coming to an end. And can you imagine listening to the bursting crescendo of Earthmover while watching this planet scatter into pieces? Oh well, the eternal worm devouring it? I have to say, despite, or perhaps more so because of, it eventually dealing with the utter meaninglessness of existence throughout, Deathconsciousness has proven to be a real lifesaver album for me. Number 1. Slowdive, Souvlaki. To people who know me, it most likely won't be that big of a surprise that Slowdive takes the number 1 spot. It was rather challenging for me to pick a favorite album though, as there's definitely something to love about every era of the band, whether it's the slightly post-punkier edge of the early works, the abstract and more stripped-down soundscapes of Pygmalion, or the exploration of more modern sound techniques on the post-reunion albums. I ultimately decided to go with Souvlaki, because, like for many others, it served as my gateway into the genre. It was the first shoegaze record I ever listened to in full length, and I vividly recall being instantly enchanted by the sublime vocal harmonies in Allison, or the swirling guitar sounds throughout Machine Gun. It had me wondering whether there was a specific term for this type of sound, opening up a whole new world for me. There's something eternally youthful about this album. Each song feels quite like an already fading moment, forever frozen in time. The emotion it evokes is quite hard to grasp, but something about it hits really close to home for me. It's a bit like the notion of being immersed in nostalgia from memories you might not even have made. I feel like it possesses an almost cinematic quality, reminiscent of a coming-of-age movie, which might partly be due to the lyrics being centered around messed up relationships, inner turmoil, and band members Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell's breakup.
She whispers while I'm sleeping.
When Neil sings, "I didn't really lose you, I just lost it for a while," in Dagger, you can instantly resonate with the internal isolation and sadness he must have felt in that moment. Yet it's also the curious exploration of sound. Whether it's the vibrant sound walls of When the Sun Hits, the psychedelic effect-laden density of Souvlaki Space Station, or the reverberating reverse drums on Melon Yellow, that rightfully earns them their spot among the most well-loved shoegaze groups nowadays. It's hard to imagine most critics didn't like Souvlaki upon its release, but I guess the current appreciation for this album affirms its timeless beauty. At the end, I'm curious to hear from you about your favorite shoegaze records. What are the albums that feel closest to your heart? Which was the one that served as your gateway into the genre? Feel free to share your own stories and top lists in the comments below. Also, make sure to check out Nate's video, where he talks about his top 10 shoegaze albums. A huge shout out to our patrons Andrea Leon, Henry Hoyt, and Jim Vonaria, and to everyone who has supported this channel. Each of you helps us get closer to our dream of creating these videos full-time one day. If you want to see more shoegaze content, consider liking, subscribing and hitting the bell button. See you next time around, and as always, stay dreamy.